doing. So we're going to be throwing, in this case, a server exception. I haven't explained this bit to you yet, but so for now we have failures. In our data sources, when we catch an exception, remember I told you we don't want to throw the raw exception. We want to convert it into our own defined, user-defined exception. So we're going to be defining our own exceptions, which is going to be an implementation of the actual Flutter or Dart exception. So we have inside of errors, we have exceptions. And in here, we're going to have the class server exception. If we also were talking to the cache, we would have class cache exception. But in this case, we're not talking to the cache, so we're going to have a server exception, which will implement, or let's make it extend, equatable, because we want to be able to equate if an exception is the same as another exception. So we extend equatable, and then we implement the raw Dart exception. And in here we have server exception. In here we will take fired this dot message, fired this dot status code, because the raw exception doesn't tell us the status code, but in our case we want to have the ability to tell the status code. This is also part of why we're creating our own exception. So whenever the server returns an error, we also pass in even the status code. We can take final string message, final integer status code, and we can override the, let me just, don't want to type that by hand. We can override this and tell it that for this class to be equal to another class, both of their messages and their status codes should be the same. So now, inside of here, we're saying that whenever the remote data source gets called, we want to throw a server exception. And this server exception is going to have a message that's going to say unknown error occurred. And it's going to have a status code of 500 because it's from the server. So it's going to be an integer rather. Let's go ahead and save that much. Constant. Add a comma. So now we're saying that whenever someone calls the create user for this test only, throw an exception. Now, how do we expect our actual implementation to handle it? This is the arrange. Now we go ahead and we act. How are we going to act? We await. Well, let's save that to a result because it will return a left something. So we'll wait for our repo implementation .create user to be called. So we actually want to call it with these same values. So I'm just going to move these up into this place. So that way everyone can have access to it instead of only that first test. So we wait and we call. So we're acting. We're calling this and we're expecting that whenever that happens, that the results that the repository implementation will give us will be equal to a left this time, and it will be equal to a left server failure, and that server failure must have the same message. Sorry. Don't we have a server failure yet? Oh, we have an API failure rather. So because we're using an API, not a server. So over here we can also change this to be API exception. Refactor. We have an API failure and we have a message, and that message must also be the message from this person. So unknown error occurred. And we also have a status code 500. Boom, boom, boom. Pop. Oh my, that's ugly. Add a constant. Save this much. Add a comma. Save that much. Yeah, that looks better. So we're expecting that whenever this person throws an API exception, that in our actual repository, when we get an exception, what do? We return a left API failure using the same message from that exception. If you want to understand this better, we could save this exception. So we could just save this exception up here. Say final test exception. The T means test. Will be equal to this exception. We can make it a constant because it's got a constant constructor. We can just simply then throw that exception, T exception. So we want to make sure that our failure is using the same message from the exception so that our user sees the same message that came from the exception. And we also have T exception. There we go. Dot status code. And over here we use the dot message. We can remove the constant because it's no longer constant. We can add the commas, format that. So now, after doing that, we actually want to verify that the remote data source, regardless of the error, we want to make sure that the remote data source.createUser got called and it got called with the correct data. And it also got called once. Then we verify that there's no more interactions with the remote data source after the error occurs. Boom. We've got a test and we're still in the red phase. So let's go ahead and run the tests. We can see that the first test will pass. The second one fails woefully. There you go. So the first test passes, but the second one fails because an unknown error occurs and we don't return a left failure. You can see it's throwing that error right back at us. So how are we going to handle that error? Because it's an unknown exception, it hasn't been handled. In order to do that, we will simply wrap this in a try-catch block. So we do this, else on API exception, we can catch the E. So in this case, we don't need to catch every exception, right? Because whatever exception occurs, no matter what sort of exception it is, whatever exception occurs in the remote data source, it will always return an API exception if it was talking to the server. If it wasn't, it will always return a cache exception if it was talking to the cache, and so on. Whatever it was talking to, we will create a generic, a custom exception for that. And in our remote implementations, we know what we're talking to, so we can expect or watch for the exception from that provider. So in this case, our provider is the API because we're creating a user. On API exception, we will simply return a left server failure, API failure rather. I'm so used to server failures because I rarely use APIs. And the message will be e.message and the status code will be e.status code. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy, and that's it. Now our test should pass because we're catching that error and we're returning an API failure that uses the same message and the same status code.